This podcast contains swear words.
Hey, fancy friends. I'm Tara Cheyenne Friedenberg, and this is Talking Shit with Tara Cheyenne, a podcast about art making, creativity in all its splendor, not giving up, and living well in the process. Process? Up for debate. Although I'm coming from the perspective of a performing artist, the themes and issues discussed here apply to all of us, whether you consider yourself an artist or no. Life is a creative act. As I mentioned, I'm Tara Cheyenne Friedenberg, your host. I'm a choreographer, an actor, dancer, writer, an educator, and very recently, a student in my first weeks of my MFA on the unceded, stolen ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations on the west coast of Turtle Island. Okay, before we get into the meat and potatoes of the episode, a little reminder to please share, rate, review, stars, all the stars, thumbs up, hearts, what are all the things? And share this episode with your friends. I know a lot of people get a lot out of it. Sometimes it's just so comforting to hear other people talking about the shit that we're thinking about. It makes a difference. And if it is in your means and inclination to donate even a little bit, helps us so much. We do give our guests honorariums. They are working artists, working really hard, and most of the time not making very much money. You can go up to the right-hand corner, www.terracheyenne.com, click that donate button. We'll put that link in the show notes. All right, my guest today, Fay Nass. She, he, they. Fay is the executive and artistic director of the Frank Theatre here in so-called Vancouver, a fantastic queer-focused theater company doing amazing work. They've got a show coming up. If you're listening to this, I'm recording September 2023. Coming up at the Culch, How Black Mothers Say I Love You, directed by Fay. A lot of amazing artists involved in that project, so get your tickets. I will be getting mine. In this interview, Fay, who is a director, curator, dramaturg, writer, producer, multidisciplinary artist, community-engaged practice person, thinker. We talk about all kinds of things. We talk about community engagement, how that relates to artistic practice. We talk about academia and art making and how that connects and disconnects. Fay has so many insightful things to say. It's very helpful for me as I enter into my Master's of Fine Arts at the old university. The idea of politics and the personal, all that good stuff, and how they feel about work in the digital plane. So do enjoy. Fay Nass, it's so good to have you on Talking Shit with Tara Cheyenne, finally.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invite, Tara.
Yeah. So we're just preparing for the interview and reading over your extensive bio. I started grad school last week, and oh, I'm so old. Anyway.
Congratulations.
The first question I think I'll start out with is because there's talk of like interdisciplinary. What is interdisciplinary? Is it a word we should even be using it anymore? And like myself, you have director, writer, dramaturg, community engaged artist, etc. What do you think about that in all your roles?
First of all, congratulations. That's really exciting. To me, in the beginning when I started my interdisciplinary, degree, MFA, I was kind of thinking like theater, it's an interdisciplinary art piece because we are constantly working with many different forms, from writers, directors, designers. So it's not like a solo practice in terms of, form and discipline. But I think for me, the idea of interdisciplinary studies was kind of like shifting my brain in the way that we were creating work, or like, systems of, in my own experience, for example, that's when I started Devised. And for me, one of the elements of Devised was like looking at lighting and sound as the two kind of main components of creation, not as a added design elements, but really like, through the framework of even from beginning, before I was like, writing the script, I was collaborating with the lighting and the sound designers, that we were kind of writing the piece for my MFA through the lens of lighting and sound. So I feel like in that sense, it was a different kind of practice of looking at form as an interdisciplinary art rather than like, added elements where those things come together. It was perhaps like a mindset shift. And for me, it was beneficial. That shift was beneficial. And also kind of looking at performance art and visual arts, like, through like a kind of theoretical as well as practical framework that I think they have in much more of a profound way have influenced my work, outside of like, these kind of hats that I wear within theater as a director, dramaturg, all of those things. But I think it was the interconnection of those forms through the interdisciplinary lens that was refreshing and exciting compared to my more, classical training in my undergrad, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's amazing. The word that popped out for me was that interconnectedness, and which I think kind of speaks to intersectionality. Like that idea, I don't know, see if you agree with this, but it's like kind of a flattening of hierarchies. Boy, we're just digging in right away, aren't we?
Yeah.
In terms of, designers, like you say, lighting and sound are so often in theater brought in like 11th hour.
Mm-hmm.
I find it heartbreaking to watch these people like madly try and integrate as opposed to, we need more money, Canada Council, everybody, so that we can bring people in right at the beginning and really collaborate, right? Have you had a project that you really feel is like, this is collaboration?
Yeah, actually, like in a few, I would say like definitely my master thesis was one project that I really wanted to always return to. Like that's like, that the luxury, it's what you're saying to Canada Council, right? Like the luxury of doing an MFA means time and space. And I don't mean only time and space, like in a literal form, but in a way that like your brain is not focused on like, running a company and like, budgeting and like million of other things. So it's like the actual mental space that exists in like that 2 years that, you're hyper focused on an idea or a thesis or a concept. So I feel like there is something very utopic about that's a privilege. And so I think like through like I had time, I had space with my collaborators over a year where I was writing the script, but through the lens of like, what is possible, what is not possible. And it's like one of the projects that even though I did it in 2011, it's still one of the, most heartfelt because it was like truly about kind of like a creative, like how do we bring these visions to work, And so there was like nothing else in terms of like, extra layers of like, dealing with, I don't know. It was like genuinely being an artist in a space and collaborating. And that's a feeling I haven't felt for a long time or not as often. And then also when I did Unveiled with a group of Iranian women that they did not have any theater training, again, like throughout a year, we were just conversing and there was just like, this beautiful like gatherings that we had every single week. And then eventually it became more and more into like form and concept coming together. That's a piece that we took Fresh Fruit Festival and to Rhubarb and Summer Works. Yeah. So like, I feel like whenever there is like not that pressure of like, kind of product within 3 weeks and you have that kind of a space and you're choosing your collaborators based on like, how you're fitting in these pieces based on your strengths and skills and weaknesses. And like, you share similar values and vision. Those projects to me are just like, okay, this is why I remember I'm doing this thing, always being poor, but the fulfillment, the satisfaction is like, I choose this over like, this was a good decision that I finished my, studying LSAT, but didn't go to law school. This is the feeling that I wanted to have, But yeah, like, they're not as often as I would like them.
Yeah, I hear you. You talked about the unveiling that project. And one of my questions was about community engagement, because you do a lot of work that is, quote unquote, engaging community. How do you think of that? How does that influence you as a creator? And how does that fold into your other work that might not be interpreted as community engagement? There's big question marks I find around what we call community and what we call quote unquote professional practice.
Totally. So, I love working like the community engaged work that I do. Like I have different components. One of them is often like around a kind of inquiry, right? Like, a question that I have, it being unveiled, being about how women were forced to take off their hijab in 1930s in Iran, and then they were forced to put their hijab on in 1978, and the effects of patriarchy as a question, and through the lens of Iranian history. That being the question, it starts with the conversation. And I feel like the people that are the most expert, or people that we don't use the word expert, but most genuine in having these conversations, are those that they come from different walks of life. So with that project, I wanted people who don't I grew up non-religious, and I also wanted to talk to people who have very different views, and to really engage communities of people that I may not even intersect with, or I wouldn't perhaps even if I lived in Iran, if I was still in Iran. And so, for the other projects as well, is just I feel like what makes me exhausted is kind of being in the same silo of the same conversations and the same mentality and the same thinking. And part of the outreach is this question of well, why don't we have enough stories, enough diverse stories? Because a lot of those people don't go to, universities, and those spaces have historically have not been welcoming. I have had those experiences all throughout my academia, and just was kind of wanting to not join the statistics of, kind of giving up. But it was hard. I still am, for the rest of my life, will be paying student loans, and most people are not as insane, to not have any kind of family funding to do that, and to not go to medical school and go to theater school to, always be broke. But I wanted to do that. And I feel like, a lot of people are smarter and they don't do that. So, but it does not mean that they don't come with wealth of stories, right? So for me, there are two aspects of it. One is engaging in the spaces that are actually diverse in way of thinking, even within the same subgroup or marginalized group. And the second is okay, how can we bring these stories to life in a way that we are not inserting stories of others within the same kind of, legacy of, Eurocentric framework, legacy of kind of well-made plays, all of those things. And how can we look at the idea of diversity of the story, but also diversity of how we tell stories? And, and so kind of the relationship between the aesthetic of the storytelling and the content of the stories have always been very interesting to me. The way of thinking is different when you speak a different language, when you have a different culture. And when you put that thinking into okay, we just kind of commissioned this person, from Iran, but we are asking them to think within this framework. The stories are often, still not really relatable in some ways, or they lack or disappoint one part or the other part of the community. And then the last aspect of it for me has always been, how can I work with communities through this longer period, but then also bringing these stories into high production qualities, right? So when you work with communities, then the quality, which are all wrong words too, but the work remains within the communities, that the person who knows that kind of work is coming to an underground venue where there are 15 people, and there's a light switch, and then everyone is working with $5 fabrics, and then you're just okay, this is done. Why can't this be a film? Why can't this be at a major arts exhibition gallery, And so usually these projects that I do go through a 2-year process, working in through devised with community members, and also really not forcing them to gain necessarily specific theater skills, but rather how can we work? And one of the things about this kind of work that has been amazing is that I never know what is going to come out of it. The diaspora project was a verbatim in the beginning at the community center, which then it became Belonging, which is one of the most major projects that the Frank has done, in terms of the aesthetic and the film, and how we created a hybrid process through that. And the film festival that the film was selected as, they were all professional and not community film festivals. Our next project, which was Mother Tongues, also ended up being a short documentary film with love intersection. And right now I'm working on a sound audio based exhibition of that project, which I'm hoping for it to be in a major gallery rather than in a. So it's just the idea of okay, these stories are happening in a very kind of organic way. We work together, but also the final exhibition does not need to not have elements of professional discipline, either being theater, being film, or performance art gallery exhibition. So I really kind of want to subvert that notion that if people don't have theater training, it means the result needs to be a community kind of underground exhibition. You know what I mean? Yeah. And also bringing that work into my professional work, to answer your last part of the question, is that I still work with that same mentality when I am working with, equity actors and everything. So how can we make this process a community-based project in terms of looking at time being a circular thing, not something that it has this urgency, breaking notions of white supremacy around flexibility means that you're not good enough, or holding time to cry for 30 minutes or an hour. It means that we are behind on page 35 and we should have been on page 45 by this time. All of those things, I try to deconstruct as well in professional settings. And and sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're very scary for many people who have worked in a certain way, and it just kind of feels like a bit maybe chaotic or not professional, but I am also interested in kind of subverting that space through the lens of what love and generosity and care means, that and bringing the community practice into those spaces as well. I hope it answers in a very long, convoluted.
That was not convoluted at all. That was and you remembered all the points. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's so fantastic and so potent. And the deconstructing of how we do things, it really does change things. And I mean, I've had the experience so many times of feeling like, oh, we just took 2 hours to check in, and having some people get really about that. But I look at the work in hindsight, or especially if I'm remounting something, I can see all that work that happened in the check-ins is in the piece. It's all this extra depth. And the question that popped into my mind while you were talking is are there changes in aesthetic that you have witnessed in your work that are influenced by, or that you can see influenced by, that new kind of practice, or this deconstructing, decolonial, dismantling the patriarchy, anti-racist care model in terms of aesthetic was just something that I...
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I feel like perhaps it has always been in there, and then it's a bit more articulated. I think that one of the things that I have always been interested in, being originally from Iran, and again, the way of thinking. And this came out a lot during my MFA master's study, this notion of kind of Descartes way of looking at art, through this lens of I think, therefore I am kind of thing, is a very different way of thinking, and as a result, way of seeing, compared to many cultures, like Persian culture, which is all about I feel, therefore I am, and so I feel there's something about the kind of viscerality that is really important to me. And perhaps many years ago when I was younger, in my 20s, I was doing kind of a lot more work that aesthetically they were all about this kind of conceptual, or kind of cerebral way of viewing the work. And I feel I'm going back more into my kind of ancestral, or in a way of feeling. But I also think the other kind of more on a formal level influence is really kind of the work that I'm more and more interested in, to be honest, is kind of performance art, sound-based gallery kind of work, which has always been there again. But I feel more and more I'm just kind of aesthetically really love working with kind of audio and sound, and telling your stories in that way. Bodies and dancers and choreography has always been something that I'm interested in. I don't dance, and I'm not a good mover personally at all, but again, telling your stories outside of words, as that kind of literal notion of words, which I think also is linked to this kind of idea of non-linear storytelling, in a way that still has the component of connecting to something that is visceral, so just not linear, because we have no kind of nothing to hold on to aesthetically, but non-linear in a way that we can still somehow feel we are part of something bigger, and as a collective experience. I think that's something that I'm, more and more interested to experiment with and work with collaborators who do actually have practice outside of theater.
Oh, I love that. I too am really interested in sound. And I noticed when I was working on a piece a few years ago, but I had stories from my parents, and they recorded them on their phones, and the emotional response of my body was so intense, way more intense than looking at photographs.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you have any thoughts about the difference between just hearing somebody's voice and an image, or a traditional kind of, somebody standing and talking.
I often think about this idea of intimacy, I love work that is intimate, even if it's a work that is like happening in like, major stages and, big theaters, doesn't matter. But like, what does intimacy mean? And I think there's something about sound and voice and audio that creates different level of intimacy. I have that experience still, like, when I'm talking on the phone with someone and, I'm just hearing them. If it's like a difficult conversation or a loving conversation or any like level of need to be more connected, I find like that intimacy of sound, the ability of sound to create that on a kind of a, like, touching the strings of one's heart is really different than even when I'm doing like, FaceTime or like the visual element gets added to it. It's almost like there is like an invisible wall. Like, I don't know if it is like kind of a phenomenological experience that we are projecting something into the other person or like, getting back too much information from their facial expressions, their movements that like, they kind of like almost like, this like there are so many other things that our brain is paying attention to that we lose that kind of intimacy. Maybe there is that. I don't know. I feel like it happens in a very like, kind of a neurological, like physiological level, like, so I don't have the kind of scientific response, but I do know that I do feel that difference as you're talking about in body as well. Like, when I hear, just like even like talking to my grandma on the phone, like
Right.
that voice is just like, it's almost like time and space, like, something gets kind of frozen in a moment too, because the voice doesn't change that much, throughout time, but the face does.
It's neat to think about. I'm like, ooh, and see if I can look up some neuroscience about that. Because it's almost like, like whisper in the dark kind of,
Literally.
Feeling. And hey, everybody, we should talk on the phone more instead of just texting and emailing all the time. It's just like, it really is quite profound and changes our like emotional state.
Mhm.
I have a question about how you have found, this is like totally selfish of me because I just started my MFA, but academia and art making. And, I'm having this, like, it's so exciting reading all this stuff, but I'm like, okay, but the art making. And when, like, afterwards, after I get the MFA, because I'm going to get it.
Mm.
Yeah, like your return to art making. Can you integrate it? Have you integrated it? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I specifically wanted to do my MFA in a way that there was a high level of academic component and like kind of philosophy and aesthetic, because I was personally needing that kind of cheese, like, the mental brain tease, like, that, and I really wanted to kind of like, read more. And that aspect for me was actually the best part, to be honest with you. Like maybe even the pause on art making in a way that I was doing the art making, but like, having this kind of bigger space of thinking about this, like, philosophical questions, many of them perhaps completely irrelevant, but I do think that like in life, outside of academia, we don't have a lot of opportunities in terms of time to think about irrelevant things. And I feel like irrelevant things are exciting in terms of that, like, sense of possibility, or that, like the synapses in your neurons, like moving super fast, thinking about things that are outside of you or, your everyday body experience. I enjoyed that aspect. The combination of doing that work and then wanting to create, a final thesis project that it was very practical based was definitely an anxiety inducing. And I don't know, like, I mean, it was, in some ways it was horrible. In other ways, like there was like, birth of new consciousness in some, in levels that I would not think about if there was not that academic, there wasn't that academic component. In terms of, what is left, like it's funny because, you talk about your thesis for 2 years and it becomes your identity. And then like, you graduate and you get your MFA and then you can no longer say, I'm doing my MFA, and the people don't ask you anymore, like, what's your thesis? And so there is like an existential crisis that definitely follows after. And then I felt like for me was about what were the things that I really love and how can I create those spaces in my actual practice? And like, what are some of the possibilities of having many, many ways of different forms and different ways that people have done things, and to be able to borrow those ways and, kind of like implement them in the way that I work things. And I think one of the direct things that came out for me was the practice of devised, to be honest, but I know like, what I, for example, studied as devised with like, and Bogart theater and all of that. I was like very much like in a group of professionals that they came together and devised. And for me, it was like, okay, how can I like, use devise in a way that like, is closer to my own sense of belonging, identity, the intersections of things that I'm interested in. So, it was kind of like, taking the old and the new and what has been hidden or forgotten and kind of combining them as like a new form of practice that I think was definitely influenced by the space that I had during my MFA.
Great.
No one cares that you haven't.
No, I know. I was very clear when I did the interview. I was like, I know this isn't going to get me anything,
Yes.
except buy me like 2 years to think about art instead of feel like a mediocre grant writer. Oh, so glamorous. Isn't it glamorous? Looking at, because I've seen a few films and digital projects you've done, I'm very interested in what is happening to our brains with the digital in good ways and bad ways. And how are you feeling about art making in the digital world and how is that crossing over? Yeah, any thoughts on that part of your practice?
Yeah, sure. So my minor is in film studies and like, cinema has always been my passion. Like sometimes like, try to hide it and like, in the lineup of VIF to not run into as many theater people to just kind of like, oh my God, like I am seeing a film tonight instead of a play. So I've been dealing with that kind of guilt. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think for me personally, like a lot of what I was trying to do during my master's was like, what I love about cinema is this dance or the tango between the relationship with the camera and what is being viewed and that control that you have. So like, how like camera can create that tension between close up and, going in and out. And so like, even in the theater piece that I did, that was like, theater in the dark was very much about how can we kind of live bring the cinematic experience into theater by like, using the interplay of light and dark as a format of like live, almost like in a copy, like almost live editing. If the eyes are getting kind of used to these images coming in and out and not knowing what's happening and like, playing with that foregrounding, backgrounding. So I have always kind of feel like for me, I love the intimacy of theater and I love the ability to play with the way that we see and just not seeing one full stage with like one same lighting from the same distance and playing with proximity. That was always very exciting for me in film, So during the pandemic and also with my cafe project, I kind of wanted to bring these elements together, the intimacy of theater and the kind of proximity of camera in the work that we did with belonging and really kind of like making it hybrid. And that work also was, between Samich and myself and Magna. I worked with them before with Magna as a community participant and, kind of brought like all these stories that they were told by many, many different communities. But like, as they are documentary filmmaker, we wanted to kind of look at it through the lens of new media, film and theater as we were kind of like rewriting these stories. So it was already parts of it. It was not a play that was then filmed, it was already like, okay, this is where it's going to be new media. This is like, okay, write the new media section. This is where it's going to be filmed. This is how. So, in that sense, again, it was like very interdisciplinary or, multidisciplinary in the way that it was written. And I have become more and more interested in that format of like, having that as like the first step rather than like, the final step. Because I think in the work that I have experienced when the theater is being filmed as a digital form, something gets lost in that. And I'm not saying like there's not things that are lost in belonging, but I think there was like, definitely an element that like, you knew that you're looking at a hybrid experimental work. And so whenever people ask me what it is, like I cannot say that belonging is film or belonging is theater or belonging is new media. Belonging is not film and is not theater and is not new media, And so I think I was kind of like trying to use that framework of creating the interdisciplinary aspect of it not being that rather than being that. So it can have its own identity, a new identity. And then, yeah, like even with the site-specific work, I was still interested, with the cafe. I was really trying to explore the idea of the body becoming the camera, being able to sit in that close proximity or moving. And so I think that they have constantly been in a role play with each other, and I think the pandemic for me specifically was an opportunity to think, to bring things that I have thought about for like, decades in my head and to kind of have the permission by our founders and by the world around me to kind of like experiment with them. And so, yeah, like, belonging was funny because like I sent it to a few theater places as a digital work, which, a year later, the culture actually was interested and they had it as a replay. But at the beginning, like when I sent it to a few places, they were like, it's not exactly, it was kind of like it had no identity, and then when it was sent to film festivals, I think because film is more used to different formats, they were just like, we don't get it. It's experimental. So it kind of got under the experimental genre in a bunch of film. So, yeah. So I think that's what I would say. Like, I feel like it is an exciting opportunity for the birth of new forms. I think to me, we should look at the COVID and the pandemic as like, many things, of how, futurist movement was born and like, how data was born. Like they all were born after major kind of, cultural, political shifts, hold, fears, war. And so I think that we need to look at it, the digital work, not as like a way that like, we're kind of extending what we were doing, but as a way of like a new form, like a possibility for the birth of new form that can exist, and we can kind of eventually gain new literacy of viewing it or observing it, because I don't think that we're there yet. We're still comparing it with what we have seen and what needs to be and what it's not. And I'm excited about the possibility of it.
I love that. Imagination is transformation. And it also, I found like for my brain went to what we were talking about right at the beginning of the interview, not asking humans to fit into boxes, not asking art to fit into, is it this or is it this? Is it this? Is it this? Which I find so boring and exhausting. Is it dance or is it theater?
Yeah.
Yes, no. Next question.
Yes.
I love your prompt, and I just want to like offer that to any artists who are listening, that like it's not film, it's not dance, it's not theater, it's not mime, it's not performance art, as just like how can we enter a creative practice with that? Because it seems really fun and a little bit like a toddler, no. And a way of rejecting that idea, because it's so colonial, that idea of like, well, you have to fit in over here or over here. What's your discipline? And even that word discipline too is like, well, that doesn't sound like a lot of fun, right? My second last question, what is coming up? What's the next project you have? What's the next thing we can get tickets or find a way to see?
Yes, a bunch of things are coming up. Like the first project that is coming up the soonest is How Black Mothers Say I Love You by Trey Anthony. I'm really excited that I have the privilege of directing it with amazing cast and crew. And it's part of the college season, opening November 2nd. There are other projects like the Mother Tongues project. We're still in the process of like, kind of further development and hoping for it to have this exhibition gallery run. And we're in our final stages of Maps of Utopia, which is our next digital solo, one-person film theater hybrid that we worked with incredible commissioned writers across Canada, trans and non-binary artists, as well as performed in Vancouver, worked with amazing film crew. So that one is going to hopefully be in this fiscal as well as part of the Frank. So yeah, bunch of things. I would say, like, in terms of buying tickets, buy your tickets for How Black Mothers Say I Love You if you can.
Oh, yeah. Get those soon. And the culture always has, if finances are a barrier, the culture is really great about making sure people can see. All right, my last question is there something, and it can be anything, that you have been doing these days to keep yourself feeling creative or gives you kind of juice or gets you through the day? Anything, whether it's like cooking or a TV show, anything at all?
Well, I have been thinking about a new project that I am, working actually. Like I've got some Canada Council grant like a year ago to write it. And like just in the past month, I've been having a new idea of it to become like a more of a dance and audio lighting piece.
Ooh.
And yeah, and it's really about kind of like my mom's story and, returning to Iran in 77, right before the revolution and getting stuck there. And then the relationship of, being in a woman's body and the idea of exile and looking at exile as like a form of kind of like literal exile versus like, being in exile in a body that you feel you were assigned to, that you don't belong to, which kind of relates to my own story. So I'm working on that. I'm, just excited to start interviewing my mom and been talking to a couple of collaborators and like just kind of the visuals are coming to me now. And so I've been spending like, an hour every day kind of looking at a blank Microsoft Works page and just writing a word or two after an hour and just kind of like images. And that has been definitely exciting to do a project that is near to my heart. And it's kind of like, my own kind of creative work. So, yeah.
That sounds exciting.
Thank you.
And beautiful. And I love the looking at the blank screen, writing one or two words. I feel like we all need to give ourselves permission to redefine what is work. And, sometimes I go into the studio, I lie on the floor, I roll around, and it's always right before I have to go. I'm almost out of time. All of a sudden, I get a big idea.
Yeah.
And I make up one move, and then I go, and it's fine.
Lovely.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. And we will link to all those projects in the show notes. And I hope to have you on the show again because I've got more questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure talking to you, Tara. Thank you for amazing questions. And this was definitely something that was inspiring this past 1 hour. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. You're inspirational.
Thank you. Have a lovely day.
You too. And that wraps it up. Thank you so much, Fay, for sitting down and talking to me. We'll definitely do it again. I've got more questions, always more questions. And thank you for listening. It really does mean a lot that you do. Get in touch. Instagram, Tara Cheyenne, TCP on the old Instagrams, Tara Cheyenne Performance on the Facebook if you're my mom or somebody who uses Facebook. Or you can just email. I do like the email, info@taracheyenne.com. Make a suggestion. Maybe you know somebody you'd like to hear interviewed on the show, or maybe you'd like to have your show advertised. Do a little plug. Love to plug. Talking Shit with Tara Cheyenne is a project of Tara Cheyenne Performance. Produced, edited, and with original music by Mark Stewart. You can get in touch with Mark at markstewartmusic.com. Mark produces podcasts and does music. So if you've got a podcast or just an idea, he's the person to talk to. And for more information on what you heard in the podcast today, go to our show notes. We'll link you to the show at the Culture, to the Frank Theater, and any other amazing little tidbits that we can link to in those show notes. And before we go on into our days or nights or mornings, again, a reminder to donate if you can. TaraCheyenne.com, upper right-hand corner, donate button, or we'll link that in the show notes. And finally, the quotation of today, I can't find who wrote this. So if you recognize it and you're like, oh my God, that was me, please let me know. I've got it written down. I've Googled it, can't find it. But it's a good one. So, good art doesn't solve the problem. It presents the problem. I love it. All right. Have a good one. We'll see you next time.
This podcast is effing good.